Welcome to Calvary Fellowship in Manchester, New Hampshire. We meet here in Manchester every Sunday to worship in song and in the Word of God. We hope you are encouraged by the music and the teaching.
Great are you, Lord, mighty in strength. You are faithful, you will ever be. We will praise you all of our days. It's for your glory, we offer everything. Raise your hands, all you nations, shout to God, all creation. How awesome is the Lord Most High. We will praise you together, for now and forever. How awesome is the Lord Most High.
Today we're going to continue in John. We're going to do this. Remember we said in John 6 there were two works signs and there's one in words. We're going to look at the second work sign. And again, because of the nature of John's writing, we get very little of the context. We have to look at the others to see why this is happening. John goes through it really quickly. John focuses more on the word sign, which we'll pick up next week. But here in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21, he relates the incident which we know is the walking on the water, yet you wouldn't gather as much from it by reading it here in John, so we'll be looking at the other Gospels as well. So here he begins in verse 16, he says, Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then a sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, It is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Now, he doesn't give us a great deal of details, so we have to go back and look at Matthew chapter 14. And Matthew gives us a little bit more of it and puts it in a better context. And we saw that was the situation last week. We said that John spends very little time on this 2-year ministry, so we have to look to the others sometimes to get the context of what's happening and more of the details. So if you turn to Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33, we see that Matthew gives us the urgency of why it's taking place, basically. In verse 22 he says, Immediately, and this is right after the feeding of the 5,000, right after, remember, they wanted to declare Jesus king. They wanted to take him by force and make him king. And so it says, Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves of the wind, because the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It's a ghost. And they cried out of fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, Be of good cheer. It is I, do not be afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And so he said, Come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So we see a little more detail there. That immediately he sent them. So the question becomes, and we look at Mark as well, Mark in chapter 6, verses 45 to 52, Mark covers essentially the same thing. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And then he departed to pray. In the middle of the night he goes out to them. But now it says in verse 50, For they all saw him and were troubled, but immediately he talked and said, Be of good cheer, as I, do not be afraid. Then he went into the boat, the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. Now, so we see another thing, that basically, why did he send them away? What's the principle? What's going on here? Why is Jesus sending them away right after he's completed this major miracle, feeding 5,000? They've collected the remnants, more than they had handed out, and yet he sends them off, and he sends them off into a storm. Why did he do something like this? Well, they were about to be caught up in the crowd effort to crown Jesus king. They've been with him for a couple of years now. And obviously this is what they're looking for. They're looking for somebody to overthrow the power of Rome, somebody to be the king. Now what he's just done for them, he's given them hope and change because he's provided universal health care. He's been healing people. And he's fed them free. So, they're about to buy into hope and change. So he sends them away rather than have them stay because it says their hearts have been hardened. They didn't understand what he had done. So they didn't understand because they're being caught up in the thinking of the people around them. And it's very easy to get caught in a crowd mentality like that. This is something they've been looking for, especially Judas. Those who try to explain away Jesus betraying Christ say, well, what he tried to do was force Jesus to declare himself king and overthrow Rome. Well, except they've been robbing for them for a period of time, so you really can't justify his behavior. But that's one of the things people come up with. Say, well, Judas was the only one that was really concerned about solving the immediate problem. And so the disciples at this point, even though they've been with Jesus a while, they've watched him heal the sick, they've watched him heal Peter's mother-in-law, all these things have gone on, they still haven't really grasped where he is and what's happening. And so he sends them out, and he sends them out into a storm. And why? What happens is when things are going well, we don't really grasp the need for God. It's much easier for us to just say, well, obviously things are working. We can just handle it ourselves from here on out. But he puts them into a storm, and it's interesting that these people panic in a storm. These are fishermen. These are people who travel the sea on a regular basis. Yet they have this difficulty, and they immediately are concerned. And then when he comes, he challenges them on their lack of faith. Because if Jesus sends you someplace, you're going to get there. He didn't say, why don't you try to go to the other side? He said, go. And then he came to them, and if obviously he could walk on the water, and the boat was having trouble, and he walked out to them. But he wanted them to understand that he did not want them to, as Romans tells us, to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So they had to get to the point where they had to understand that, when things are going good, you don't need God. But when you're in difficulty and he shows up, that's a test of your faith. So he was testing their faith. Do they really understand what's going on? Do they understand why he sent the multitude away? Why he wasn't willing to become king at this particular point? Because he's not there to deal with their physical problems. He's not there to deal with economics. He's there to deal with the spiritual well-being. If they get the spiritual part right, the rest will fall into place. And that's something we have to understand. That if we get our relationship with God right, everything else works. If we focus on the things of the world, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by all the things we're doing, by all the problems we have, by finding solutions short of actually turning to God. And so he wanted them to understand this. So he sent them out into the storm so they would realize that he wasn't there just to meet physical needs. And that he wanted to make clear to them that he is the creator and he's in control. Because what happened? He stilled the wave. He stilled the waves, calmed the storm. So his power goes beyond just meeting the immediate needs of the people. And of course, Mark told us that they had not understood because their hearts were hardened. And it's when we're in prosperity, very often that happens. We don't really turn to God. But when it's a crisis, all of a sudden people remember God. On 9/11, people ran from ground zero all the way to Brooklyn. That's probably the most exercise people in New York had in their entire life. But they ran all the way to Brooklyn Tabernacle. And after that, they just go to the gym. And people started saying, God bless America. They don't know which God they're singing to, but they sing, God bless America. So when they're in a crisis, people turn to God sometimes. But now here we are, 9 years later, and people are still trying to find solutions in the ways of man instead of the ways of God.